So the title of this very long section is Orthopraxy. It's similar to orthodoxy, but it refers to the orthodoxy of practice. So behavioral conformity of the citizenry is what it refers to in the context of propaganda. So let me get to the read now. We now come to an absolutely decisive fact. Propaganda is very frequently described as a manipulation for the purpose of changing ideas or opinions, of making individuals believe some idea or fact, and finally of making them adhere to some doctrine. All matters of mind. Or to put it differently, propaganda is described as dealing with beliefs or ideas. If the individual is a Marxist, it tries to destroy his conviction and turn him into an anti-Marxist, and so on. It calls on all the psychological mechanisms, but appeals to reason as well. It tries to convince, to bring about a decision, to create a firm adherence to some truth. Then, obviously, if the conviction is sufficiently strong, after some soul searching, the individual is ready for action. Now, Jacques Lal, he says that this line of reasoning is completely wrong. To view propaganda as being what it was in 1850 is to cling to an obsolete concept of man and the means to influence him. It is to condemn oneself to understand nothing about modern propaganda. And when I think of propaganda, I also think of modern institutions, such as marriage, which maybe in 1850 allowed individuals to make choices with their own beliefs and so forth, like he just said earlier. But today are a completely different environment and ball game. So one cannot go in with the same ideals that one, or even the same understanding, especially that one went in 1850 about it. So the aim of modern propaganda So the aim of modern propaganda is no longer to modify ideas, but to provoke action. Give me that ring for that whap. Or give me that paycheck, right? Fuck me and get some money. It is no longer to change adherence to a doctrine. So the aim of modern propaganda is no longer to modify ideas, but to provoke action. It is no longer to change adherence to a doctrine, but to make the individual cling irrationally to a process of action. It is no longer to lead to a choice, but to loosen the reflexes. So changing your reflexes. It is no longer to transform an opinion, but to arouse an active and mythical belief. Difference between beliefs and opinions. One involves a lot more doubt. Alright, let us note here in passing how badly equipped opinion surveys are to God's propaganda. We have to come back to this point in the study of propaganda effects. Simply to ask an individual if he believes this or that, or if he has this or that idea, gives absolutely no indication of what behavior he will adopt or what action he will take. Only action is of concern to modern propaganda, for its aim is to precipitate an individual's action with maximum effectiveness and economy. Here he's saying that it's all about action, baby, not so much about the beliefs and the opinions. So these opinion surveys are flawed in their inherent nature. Especially, he's talking about America here, so we know what he's talking about in this election season. So, when one analyzes the great modern systems of propaganda, one always finds this primary aim of producing action, of mobilizing the individual. Occasionally, it is expressly stated, as Goebbels in Haltung and Simtung, but the former is of greater behavior is of greater importance than morale. After a bloody raid, Goebbels could state, the Stimmung or the morale is quite low, but that means little. The behavior holds well. So the morale is volatile and varies readily. Therefore, above all, the right action must be obtained, the right behavior maintained. In the analysis of propaganda, specialists have especially noted this desire to obtain immediate action rather than a change of opinion. The same idea is held by Mao Zedong. Propaganda aims at mobilizing the masses, thus it is not necessary to change their opinions, but to make all individuals jointly attack a task. And that's how I felt at the club too, and the officer team. It's like, it wasn't about ideas, it was just about brute or rote action, at least for a non-president. So I was like, fuck this shit. Even political education, so important with Mao, aims essentially at mobilization. And in the Soviet Union, political education has occasionally been criticized for taking some intellectual and purely domestic turn to secure action and then failing in its aim. The task of agitation is not to educate but to mobilize people. And there is always a matter of actual involvement in the precise tasks defined by the party, for example, to obtain increased productivity. Alright, so they were talking about the maximum effectiveness and the economy in the individual's action that propaganda seeks. The propagandist therefore does not normally address himself to the individual's intelligence, for the process of intellectual persuasion is long and uncertain, and the road from such intellectual conviction to action even more so. The individual rarely acts purely on the basis of an idea. Moreover, to place propaganda efforts on the intellectual level Moreover, to place propaganda efforts on the intellectual level will require that the propagandist engage in individual debate with each person, an unthinkable method. I guess that's not efficient enough. It is necessary to obtain at least a minimum of participation from everybody. It can be active or passive, but in any case, it is not simply a matter of public opinion. To see propaganda only as something related to public opinion implies a great intellectual independence on the part of the propagandee, who is, after all, only a third party in any political action, and who is asked only one opinion. It's a lot of logic here. This obviously coincides with a conception of liberal democracy, which assumes that the most one can do with a citizen is to change his opinion in such a fashion as to win his vote at election time. The concept of a close relationship between public opinion and propaganda rests on the presumption of an independent popular will. If this concept were right, the role of propaganda would be to modify that popular will, which of course expresses itself in votes. But what this concept does not take into consideration. Oh, fuck. Into consideration is that the injection of propaganda into the mechanism of popular action actually suppresses liberal democracy, after which we are no longer dealing with votes or the people's sovereignty. Propaganda therefore aims solely at participation. The participation may be active or passive. Active if the propaganda has been able to mobilize the individual for action. Passive, the individual does not act directly but psychologically supports the action. But one may ask, hold on. Okay. The passive participation is what Goebbels meant when he said, I conceive of a radio program that will make each listener participate in the events of the nation. But at the same time, the listener is forced into passivity by the dictator. That's what I thought the president was. At the club. In the club. Anyway. I like to know what I'm doing and learn as I'm doing. So, where are we? Yeah, also it's interesting to think of the propagandists as the modern female, especially the Jezebel types, the ones who have experience and skills in the game. Because when you analyze it through these lenses, then their blind-sided tactics that they're just in a loop doing gets to be very clarifying to you, the individual. All right, so the concept of, so passive and active participation. But then one may ask, does this not bring us right back to public opinion? Certainly not, for opinion leaves the individual a mere spectator who may eventually, but not necessarily, resort to action. Therefore, the idea of participation is much stronger. So, another thing with females, don't judge the words, but judge the actions. So the idea of participation is much stronger. The supporter of a football team, though not physically in the game, makes his presence felt psychologically by rooting for the players, exciting them, and pushing them to outdo themselves. Similarly, the faithful who attend Mass do not interfere physically, but their communicant participation is positive and changes the nature of the phenomena. These two examples illustrate what we mean by passive participation obtained through propaganda. So yeah, that bitch at the club was trying to get me to be a passive participator in her tyrannical, tyrannical regime. Positively tyrannical. Such an action cannot be obtained by the process of choice and deliberation. No wonder they don't want to expose their past and their true nature. To be effective, propaganda must constantly short-circuit all thought and decision. There goes the changes in fashion always occurring. It must operate on the individual at the level of the unconscious. Something you're not aware of. He must not know that he is being shaped by outside forces. Except for those mystical beliefs, I guess, that they promote, these propagandists. So this is one of the conditions for the success of propaganda. But some central core in him must be reached in order to release the mechanism in the unconscious, which will provide the appropriate and expected action. All right, chill time. chillum? Where's my chillum? Gotta take a draw. But I can't find my chillum. Don't want to smoke out of a bong piece. Gotta find that C right in front of my eyes, G. That's how it usually be. Got the last bud of my trees. Got to go get some cashish, cause that's the way they sell the grashish. Gotta pack the pipe with the tobacco, make it burn easily. Put the mask on the base, just for safety. Got the OGC. JLM. We have just said that action exactly suited to its ends must be obtained. It's all about the Benjamins, right? Gotta get them ends. The propagandist needs those ends, yeah? Gotta pay them rents. Ends must be obtained. This leads us to a state that the classic but outmoded view of propaganda consists in defining it as an adherence of man to an orthodoxy. So this leads us to state that if the classic but outmoded view of propaganda consists in defining it as an adherence of man to an orthodoxy, true modern propaganda seeks, on the contrary, to obtain an orthopraxy, an action that in itself, and not because of the value judgments of the person who is acting, and leads directly to a goal, which for the individual is not a conscious and intentional objective to be attained, but which is considered such by the propagandist. So the sleepwalkers got to act, got to riot, got to demand. So maybe I'm being too harsh to some females because maybe they are the ones who are unconscious, but their behaviors are not righteous, right? So that's all I'm saying, really. The propagandist knows what objective should be sought and what action should be accomplished, and he maneuvers the instrument that will secure precisely this action. The propagandist is actually the Jezebel and her priesthood. What Coach Greg Adams said, her chimpanzee army, her chimpanzee army of Jezebel, always backing her up. This is an example of a more general problem. The separation of, okay, this is really profound, actually. So now we know the difference of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Orthopraxy is just blind action, similar to the phrase sleepwalking. So the general problem is that there is a separation of thought and action in our society. How true is that? We are living in a time when systematically thought without our wanting it so, or though without our wanting it so, Action and thought are being separated. In our society, he who thinks can no longer act for himself. I can appreciate that. He must act through the agency of others, and in many cases, he cannot act at all. He who acts cannot, but he who acts cannot first think out his action, either because of lack of time and the burden of his personal problems, or because society's plan demands that he translate others' thoughts into action. That's our working corporate slavery. And we see the same division within the individual himself, for he can use his mind only outside the area of his job in order to find himself, to use his leisure to better himself, to discover what best suits him, and thus to individualize himself. Whereas in the context of his work, he yields to the common necessity, the common method, the need to incorporate his own work into the overall plan. Escape into dreams is suggested to him while he performs wholly mechanized actions. That's like the Soma break of Brave New World. Every time you have conflicting thought, just escape into dreams. Take a Soma vacation. Speaking of which, I better pack my pipe again. The pipe. Respect the pipe. The pipe. Respect the pipe. I look at every hip-hop magazine. It seems that the blunts are being passed around the scene. Things. And the government would judge it as a lesser amount. I guess he understands, he has his chance, he passes his life out. But his pass is incomplete, cause I can tell in the smell. To let the Dutchie pass me by, let the left catch hell. If I wanted to smoke tobacco, I'd hit a skinny white bitch. Wow, if I wanted to smoke tobacco, I'd hit a skinny white bitch. I guess he's talking about the fact that I used to guess that he was talking about tobacco cancer stick is a skinny white bitch, but maybe tobacco makes you more angry too, I think. So maybe he's actually literally saying he's gonna hit a skinny white bitch if he starts smoking tobacco. Where's my motherfucking rag? Damn, bro. Can't find the motherfucking. Right in front of me again. Just saying. The pipe, respect the pipe. Twisting, twirling, whirling, wings of fire as I step into your lair. So propaganda creates the same division of thought and action. Of course, it does not cancel out personality. It leaves man complete freedom of thought, except in his political or social action, where we find him channeled and engaged in actions that do not necessarily conform to his private beliefs. So everywhere where you listen to others for your knowledge base, which is pretty much everything, can be infected by propaganda. So that's social and political, or the masculine and the feminine, everything. So he can have political convictions and still be led to act in a manner apparently contradictory to them. Thus, the twists and turns of skillful propaganda do not present insurmountable difficulties. The propagandist can mobilize man for action that is not in accord with his previous convictions. Modern psychologists are well aware that there is not necessarily any continuity between conviction and action, and no intrinsic rationality in opinions or acts. Into these gaps in continuity, propaganda inserts its lever. I think this is especially true for females. That's why there's all those Illuminati quotes about targeting the females first and making them change the men's actions, because they tend to yield too readily to female and their manipulations. So into these gaps in continuity, propaganda inserts its lever. It does not seek to create wise or reasonable men, but proselytes and militants. What do we see in 2020 on the streets? But proselytes and militants. This brings us back to the question of organization. For the proselyte is incited to action by propaganda, cannot be left alone, cannot be entrusted to himself. Hence they cowards roll in groups, right? Or mob rule society today. And the Karens love that. Especially the pretty ones used to be able to command that mob very easily, but now with their masks, they're finding themselves more challenged in these challenging times. So they're exposed very easily. If the action obtained by propaganda is to be appropriate, it cannot be individual. It must be collective. Propaganda has meaning only when it obtains convergence, coexistence of a multiplicity of individual action reflexes whose coordination can be achieved only through the intermediary of an organization. Antifa, yo, BLM. Moreover, the action reflex obtained by, or it's like, say Black Lives Matter, bro. Repeat after me. Black Lives Matter, bro. So that's all the trademarks of a cult and a organization. Moreover, the action reflex obtained by propaganda is only a beginning, a point of departure. It will develop harmoniously only if there is an organization in which, and thanks to which, the proselyte becomes militant. So the action reflex only develops through the organization, where the proselyte gets converted and baptized into a militant. Without organization, psychological incitement leads to excesses and deviation of action in the very course of its development. So that's what they tell me, that I'm not skilled enough in propaganda to be making these public statements, because my propaganda is going to cause psychological incitement because I'm giving power back to the individual, I guess. That's what I'm thinking, but no. It's psychological incitement leading to excesses and deviation of action in the very course of the development. All right, so through organization, the proselyte receives an overwhelming impulse that makes him act with the whole of his being. He's actually transformed into a religious man in the psychosociological sense of the term. Justice, SJW time, enters into the action he performs. Justice enters into the action he performs because of the organization ta-da, of which he is a part. Thus, his action is integrated into a group of conforming actions. Not only does such integration seem to be the principal aim of all propaganda today, it is also what makes the effect of propaganda endure. Wow, big stuff. For action makes propaganda's effect irreversible. Now there's a huge footnote to that, which I kind of want to come back to. But maybe I can get through it with this weed in me. We must insist again that organization is an intrinsic part of propaganda. It is illusory to think one can separate them. Since 1928, an agitator in the Soviet Union must be an organizer of the masses. Before that, Lenin said that a newspaper is propaganda, collective agitation and collective organization. So organizing the masses. That's what Obama used to do too, huh? He was quite a Marxist. Or Maoist, maybe. Since China is the big dog now thanks to their policies. Similarly, Mao Zedong insists on the difference between communist and capitalist armies, reminding us that the former is responsible for mobilizing the masses through propaganda and organization. That's like the Democrat and the Republican now, I guess. How the Democrats have mobilized the masses so powerfully through their propaganda and organizations. He always ties those two elements together. Propaganda among the masses goes hand in hand with organization of the masses. And Maurice Maigret recalls the relationship between the two elements in connection with the May 13 demonstration in Algiers. These examples demonstrate the error made by writers who want to separate propaganda and organization. Very interesting. So, action makes the propaganda's effect irreversible. He who acts in obedience to propaganda can never go back. So these Karens are here to stay, y'all. That's why I say RAG 2030. RAG. RAK. Rape a Karen today. Or just stone her to death like she deserved long ago. False witness and biatch. So he who acts in obedience to propaganda can never go back. He is now obliged to believe in that propaganda because of his past action. So many of these Karens have to believe in their sinful ways because of their past actions. He is obliged to receive from it his justification and authority. So he's obliged to receive from the propaganda the justification and authority, without which his action will seem to him absurd or unjust, which would be intolerable. Hence I speak of the cognitive dissonance amongst the sheeple. He is obliged to continue to advance in the direction indicated by propaganda, for action demands more action. It's an endless loop. He is what one calls committed, which is girls always want the commitment. That's all a propaganda tactic, as you can see, which is certainly what the Communist Party anticipates, for example, and what the Nazis accomplished. Feminazis and femi-terrorists, y'all. So the femi-terrorists have anticipated and succeeded quite a bit. And the feminazis have accomplished decades ago as their predecessors. predecessors. The man who acted in accordance with the existing propaganda has taken his place in society. So the man who acted in accordance with the existing propaganda has taken his place in society. So they do have their bread and circuses in abundance today. From then on, he has enemies. Often he has broken with his milieu or his family. Yeah, many of those Toastmaster thoughts are always dissing their family in public company. He may be compromised. He is forced to accept the new milieu and the new friends that propaganda makes for him. Yeah, that was my misery in my old life. Often he has committed an act reprehensible by traditional moral standards and has disturbed a certain order. He needs a justification for it. So that's what they're talking about, the patriarchy right here. So they know that there is a real patriarchy, not the one they talk about, but they have disturbed the natural order. So they need a justification for this. And she gets more deeply involved by repeating the act in order to prove that it was just. Thus she is caught up in a movement that develops until it totally occupies the breadth of her conscience. Poor Jiminy Cricket locked up in there. Propaganda now masters her completely, and we must bear in mind that any propaganda that does not lead to this kind of participation is mere child's play. Oh man, this is fat stuff. Take a hit of the tweed, make me drop to my knees. Gotta show love to the green leaves. Steadily smoking that trees, making that cheese. Some bacca. That's all I got back. What? Alright, where are we at? But we may properly ask how propaganda can achieve such a result. A type of reflex action by short-circuiting the intellectual process. The claim that such results are indeed obtained by propaganda will beget skepticism from the average observer. Strenuous denial from the psychologist, and the accusation that this is mere fantasy, contradicted by experience. Later, we shall examine the validity of experiments made by psychologists in these fields, and their adequacy in regard to the subject. For the moment, we shall confine ourselves to stating that observation of men who were subjected to a real propaganda, Nazi or communist, confirms the accuracy of the schema we have just drawn. So he is not dependent on the authoritas We actually observe through real experience of real people. We must, however, qualify our statement. We do not say that any man can be made to obey any incitement to action in any way, whatever, from day one to the next. We do not say that in each individual prior elementary mechanisms exist on which it is easy to play and which will unfailingly produce a certain effect. Maybe that's why these Jezebels go after the guys that don't want them, because they're always trying to perfect their propaganda techniques. We do not hold with a mechanistic view of man, but we must divide propaganda into two phases. These Jezebels definitely do, though. But we must divide propaganda into two phases. There is pre-propaganda or sub-propaganda, and there is active propaganda. This follows from what we have said earlier about the continuous and permanent nature of propaganda. Obviously, what must be continuous is not the active, intense propaganda of crisis, but the sub-propaganda that aims at mobilizing individuals, or in the etymological sense, to make them mobile and mobilizable in order to thrust them into action at the appropriate moment. So pre-propaganda, and then the crisis, and the final propaganda. Problem, reaction, solution. It is obvious that we cannot simply throw a man into action without any preparation, without having mobilized him psychologically and made him responsive, not to mention physically ready. The essential objective of pre-propaganda is to prepare man for a particular action. I think in terms of Jezebels, that's the hours they spend in front of the mirror making up their face and body. So that's pre-propaganda. It's very important for their influence and action, to prepare a man for the action, and to make him sensitive to some influence, to get him into condition for the time when he will effectively, and without any delay or hesitation, participate in an action. Seen from this angle, pre-propaganda does not have a precise ideological objective. It has nothing to do with an opinion, an idea, a doctrine. It proceeds by, so just, I just want to get married. Nothing about what the Bible says about marriage between a man and a woman, or even what a man and a woman is supposed to be. No, just actions. It proceeds by psychological manipulations, by character modifications, by the creation of chimpanzee feelings or stereotypes, useful when the time comes. It must be continuous, slow, imperceptible. Man must be penetrated in order to shape such tendencies. Girl power. Woo. He must be made to live in a certain psychological climate. George Orwellian style, 1984, Brave New World. The two great routes that this sub-propaganda takes are the conditioned reflex and the myth. 1984 was about the conditioned reflex, and so was Brave New World, but actually both had myths, so yeah. Both were very good books. One more fascist and socialist exposing, and one exposing the technological paradise that was dreamed up by these scientists century ago, or even centuries ago. Propaganda tries first of all to create conditioned reflex in the individual, so that's schooling, by training him so that certain words, signs, or symbols, even certain persons or facts, provoke unfailing reactions. Despite many protests from psychologists, creating such conditioned reflexes, collectively as well as individually, is definitely possible. But of course, in order for such a procedure to succeed, a certain amount of time must elapse, a period of training and repetition. One cannot hope to obtain automatic reactions after only a few weeks' repetition of the same formulas. A real psychic reformation must be undertaken so that after months of patient work, a crowd will react automatically in the hoped for direction to some image. Idolatry, right? And that's what it's all about. That's what the Ten Commandments warned about. Not to put idols before the true living God. And yet, that's all our life is all about nowadays. Chasing after money, chasing after the pussy, chasing after the car, and so forth. Experiences. And our people have become experiences because of all this insanity. So anyway, a psychic reformation must undertake so they can react automatically to the image in the hoped for direction. But this preparatory work is not yet propaganda, for it is not yet immediately applicable to a concrete case. What is visible in propaganda, what is spectacular, and seems to us often incomprehensible or unbelievable, is possible only because of such slow and not very explicit preparation. Without it, nothing would be possible. So this is pre-propaganda, or sub-propaganda, working on the conditioned reflex. Or what the Jezebel will be like, look at me and feel a sense of security or emotional fulfillment, I guess. On the other hand, the propagandist, that's pre-propaganda, so on the other hand, the propagandist tries to create myths by which man will live, which respond to his sense of the sacred. So I guess sometimes wives take their husbands to church too. I've seen that in American Dad, so it must be true. Or a Family Guy. So which respond to his sense of the sacred. Myths. By myth we mean an all-encompassing, activating image, a sort of vision of desirable objectives that have lost their material, practical character. That's what I was talking about marriage, huh? And have become strongly colored, overwhelming, all-encompassing, and which displace from the conscious all that is not related to it. Such an image pushes man to action precisely because it includes all that he feels is good, just, and true. Without giving a metaphysical analysis of the myth, we will mention the great myths that have been created by various propagandas. The myth of race, of the proletariat, of the Führer, of the communist society, of productivity. Yeah, man. Like I'm supposed to be a dropout or a slacker, but I've done a lot in my life and grown a lot, so I don't feel that way at all. But that's because most people believe in these myths, and these are just a few of them. Eventually, the myth takes possession of a man's mind so completely. Let me do the gender switch because I want to be PC. Eventually, the myth takes possession of a woman's mind so completely that her life is consecrated to it. Feminism. But that effect can be created only by slow, patient work, by all the methods of propaganda, not by any immediate propaganda operation. Only when conditioned reflexes have been created in a man and he lives in a collective myth can he be readily mobilized. So yeah, that's pre-propaganda and myths, or the actual propaganda, usually delivered in a time of crisis, and then man can be readily mobilized. Although the two methods of myth and conditioned reflex can be used in combination, each has separate advantages. The United States prefers to utilize the myth, so-called American dream. The Soviet Union has for a long time preferred the reflex, so-called jackboot up your butt. The important thing is that when the time is ripe, the individual can be thrown into action by active propaganda, by the utilization of the psychological levers that have been set up, and by the evocation of the myth. For people like me, they try to use the shaming tactics more. So instead of the myth, which doesn't work on us, I've been called a ISIS sympathizer because of a certain opinion I might have expressed that wasn't orthopraxic enough. Or I've also been called a Trump supporter because I used to be into Alex Jones and learning from Alex Jones. Although now I know that America is not the final solution, because the Constitution has a con right there at the start of it. So that can't be the way. I think Jesus had some things to say about the way, which were more, which feel more real. But anyway, let's get back to the text. So no connection necessarily exists between his action and the reflex or the content of the myth. So no connection between action and the reflex or the myth. The action is not necessarily psychologically conditioned by some aspect of the myth, for the most surprising thing is that the preparatory work leads only to man's readiness. Once he is ready, he can be mobilized effectively in very different directions. But of course, the myth and the reflex must be continually rejuvenated and revived, or they will atrophy. That is why pre-propaganda must be constant, whereas active propaganda can be sporadic, when the goal is a particular action or involvement. So action is not necessary, so no connection exists between action, reflex, or myth. So action and the reflex or the myth is not really logically tied together, is what he's saying. As this whole propaganda, we know it's all about cons and trickery. So man is not really conscious when he's doing these things, therefore logic does not enter into the equation. It's only to make him trigger, basically. So political education, in Lenin and Mao's sense, corresponds exactly to our idea of sub-propaganda, or basic propaganda. Political education is sub-propaganda, or basic propaganda, for Goebbels. For this education is in no way objective or disinterested. Its only goal is to create in the individual a new Weltanschauung, inside which each of the propositions of propaganda will become logical. Each of its demands will be indisputable. It is a matter of forming new presuppositions, new stereotypes that are prior justifications for the reasons and objectives which propaganda will give to the individual, So it's all tilling the field and then planting the seed. But while the prejudices and stereotypes in our societies are created in a somewhat incoherent fashion, singly and haphazardly, in political education, we have the systematic and deliberate creation of a coherent set of presuppositions that are above challenge. Probably at the beginning of the Soviet Revolution, such political education did not uh, have precise objectives or practical aims. Indoctrination was an end in itself. But since 1930, this concept has changed, and political education has become the foundation of propaganda. Mao had done this even earlier. In the Soviet Union, ideological indoctrination is now the means of achieving an end. It is the foundation on which propaganda can convince the individual, hitting no, of whatever it wants to convince him. So, in political education, we have the systematic and deliberate creation of a coherent set of presuppositions that are above challenge. All right. To make this clear, we will use the classic terms of propaganda and agitation. That what they're doing, the propagandists in those countries. We will use the classic terms of propaganda and agitation taken in a new sense. Propaganda is the elucidation of the Marxist-Leninist doctrine and corresponds to pre-propaganda. Agitation's goal is to make individuals act hitting no as a function of their political education and also in terms of this education or propaganda. Active experience in effect makes further education easier. So I guess Antifa Part 2 is going to be even worse. The different elements are easily mixed. The radio network is given the task to increase political knowledge and political awareness or pre-propaganda, and to rally the population to support the policy of the party and the government, which is the actual propaganda. The film industry is given orders that even comedies must organize the thoughts and feelings of the audience to the required proletarian direction. That's why Dave Chappelle was targeted pretty badly back in the day after Obama came in. The effects of such political education, or even when Bush was there, I think, definitely. The effects of such political education are often described by Mao. It creates class consciousness. It destroys the individualist and petit bourgeois spirit while assimilating the individual in a collectivity of thought. That's what these communists love, that, oh, their light will spread everywhere and all the darkness will go away with their candle. But similarly, they're the most murderous and most intolerant intellectually of their opposition. So it destroys the individualist and bourgeois spirit while assimilating the individual in a collectivity of thought. It creates ideological conformity in a new framework. Ideological conformity in a new framework. And it leads to understanding the necessity for the sharing of property. They don't believe in property rights. It's all about communalism for these guys, including the females. Unfortunately, in the old days, there used to be a time when you could just demand sex from a woman when they were communal property. But now the logic has been turned upside down, where the woman gets to demand sex whenever she wants, while she is communal property. So, anyway, no private property. So the necessity for the sharing of property, obedience to the state. So my mom has a job, so I don't have a job, so I gotta share my car with my mom again. Obedience to the state or to the dad. Creation of authorita and hierarcha. So authority and hierarchy is necessitated by the organizational aspect of their propaganda apparatus. It leads the comrade to vote for suitable representatives and to withstand the weariness and the difficulties of the battle for increased production, efficiency. United Nations mantra. We cannot tolerate any nationalism, especially vaccine nationalism. How dare the haughty Americans claim that they have the right to their own bodies and the sanctity and impenetrability by their own will of their own bodies. Impossible. Alright, so withstand the weariness and the difficulties of the battle. It's all propaganda. This describes perfectly the role of infrastructure assigned to political education in the process of propaganda. Infrastructure assigned to political education. That's what I just meant by the organization. And then we have the internal characteristics, chapter 2, which I'll get to later. Actually, no, it's not chapter 2, it's part 2 of chapter 1. Internal characteristics. And we'll get to knowledge of the psychological terrain next time. Page 33. And I'll check it out with Propaganda by Jacques Ellul. This is a far more frightening work than any of the nightmare novels of George Orwell. With the logic, which is the great instrument of French thought, he explores and attempts to prove the thesis that propaganda, whether its ends are demonstrably good or bad, like the communists say, by any means necessary, because their ends are supposedly great. So Ellul explores and attempts to prove the thesis that propaganda, either for good or bad ends, is not only destructive to democracy, it is perhaps the most serious threat to humanity operating in the modern world. By your Los Angeles Times writer, Mr. Kirsch. I agree completely and wholeheartedly with his thesis. And next we have the theme of propaganda is quite simply that when our new technology encompasses any culture or society, the result is propaganda. So these thoughts are quite thoughtful in their use of propaganda, even though they might be unconscious of the metaphysical aspects or unable to explain the metaphysical aspects of it like he does so well. The technology has made them masters of propaganda. So the theme is that our new technology has encompassed the society and resulted in propaganda, and he has made many, many splendid contributions in this book by Marshall McLuhan from Book Week. And I'll check it out with the end of the first part of the first chapter of Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes by Jacques Ellul, also the author of The Technological Society, another great book I want to read in the future. Peace outside.